Okay, right. Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I think if we were having our normal SAGE meeting, we probably might have cancelled today with the weather. So here we are, all safely tucked at home in the warmth. And I'm not only delighted, but honoured to welcome Rabbi Salasnik to us today from Israel. And no doubt he'll tell us what the weather's like out there. Lovely to see you, Rabbi. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Rabbi Salasnik is well known not only to members of Bushy Shore, but right across the Jewish community. He was our rabbi in Bushy for 37 years and saw through a significant growth in our community and development over that period of time, from School Lane to the building that we are now in. I had the pleasure of working with Rabbi Salasnik very closely for about 19 years, when I took over the responsibility of Bushy Community Cares from Robert Dickman and Deborah Calms, who set it up originally. And we worked quite closely together. One of the many attributes that Rabbi Salasnik has, and I think the terminology we might use for this is mishpuchology. There is nothing he doesn't know about everybody's family and their relationships and who they related to and their third or fourth distant cousins. And I had the experience, I remember the first time I had the experience of this wealth of knowledge is that I had arranged to meet with him to get some information on a number of our members who we were looking to support, and I just wanted to understand a little bit about them. I think it was about 40 or 50 people, names I wanted to go through, and I think I'd allocated about half an hour for this meeting. We sat down together, and about 2.5 hours later, after I'd been given the absolute detail on every one of the family and their relationships, and most amazing. So I never underestimated that power from there on in. It was absolutely wonderful. So we are delighted to welcome you here from Israel. Rabbi, we are
towards me a little bit.
Waiting to hear how life is treating you in Israel. You've been there, what, for, is it about 4 years now? I've lost track of time.
About
sure
almost 4.5.
4.5, so I wasn't far out. So we are waiting to hear how you've settled down, how the family is, how you're getting on, how you spend your time. So over to you.
Well, first of all, I'm going to upset all of you. How can I upset every one of you in one moment? I'm going to tell you that the weather here in Jerusalem is 71 Fahrenheit, 22 centigrade.
Lovely, Magic.
Which I think, I just checked that you're 32 Fahrenheit, 0 centigrade. And we haven't seen snow for quite a time. Although many years ago, one Hanukkah, I was in Israel, and it was snowing in Israel, and it was not snowing in England. So, you know, it's not always so wonderful here, but it just happens that the weather is better here at the moment. Now, you may have noticed a difference. I don't think that any of you ever saw me in Bushy without a tie. In Israel, if I'm wearing a tie, it's probably Shabbat. I should add that besides the regulars who are here, it's possible that I may have some relatives. But if they're here because of Eva and Ronnie Levine. Eva and Ronnie Levine have a very close friend who happens to be my mother's second cousin. And they've told her, and she's told some of the other family. So if you see anybody that you don't usually see, that may be the reason. The last comment before going into what I prepared is if only I could have muted all of you during Shabbat services, maybe I'd still be with you. Now, in the summer of 2006, a boy aged 1 year old living in Hendon was kidnapped by his mother and father and taken to Israel. The 4 grandparents, that's Malki and the late Danny Louis and my wife and I, and the 4 great-grandparents were therefore deprived of his company except for those planned occasions when they visited Israel or he was brought to London. Over the next 10 years, this boy was joined by 3 brothers and 1 sister. Since we have made Aliyah, there has been a further sister, and also we have had a further 4 grandchildren. This was in 2006, 2006, this was a defining moment for us. My wife would say, we are in the wrong country. She did not mean that Britain was the wrong country. She meant that the right country is the one where the grandchildren are. My own perspective was similar. On my 4 grandparents, my maternal grandfather, who took me to interesting places such as the British Museum, died when I was 6. My Israeli grandfather never left Israel on principle, and so I only saw him when I visited Israel. A little bit more about this grandfather. In 1914, when the First World War started, and remember the Ottoman Empire, but Jerusalem, obviously Jerusalem and the whole of what was then called Palestine was under the Ottoman Empire. And a lot of the Jews in Jerusalem had a Russian background. And therefore, with Russia on the same side as Britain and France, and with the Ottoman Empire siding with Germany and Austria, many of the Jews in Jerusalem were on the wrong side. Now, some of my grandfather's relatives, including his older sister, actually went off to Egypt. There was a whole Jewish community that moved into Alexandria at that time. And he had that opportunity and he declined it. What he and 2 of his brothers did was they managed to get American, like a temporary American citizenship. And that helped them until America entered the First World War, when my grandfather and his 2 brothers, the 2 brothers who were there, went into hiding. One of the brothers actually came out of hiding, was caught by the Turks and taken to Damascus, where he died. So in other words, it was living in Israel, not leaving Israel ever, was so important for my grandfather. My grandmother, my Israeli grandmother, did visit us once in London when I was 7. Otherwise, I saw her only when I visited Israel. So the only grandparent I saw regularly and really grew up with was my maternal grandmother. I was therefore determined to live where the grandchildren are. This meant Jerusalem, as all of them have been living there since 2007. Our eldest grandchild, when I told you he was kidnapped by his parents, they lived actually in Ramat Bet Shemesh, which is probably a half an hour's drive outside Jerusalem for the first year before they moved into HaNiv, Jerusalem. And so my wishes and Judith's wishes fitted in with each other. And therefore, there was never any question. And even after retirement at 65 became voluntary rather than mandatory, we had already decided that in 2016, we were making Aliyah. When we came, all grandchildren were our older son's children, and they were living in HaNiv. We realized that our second son and daughter-in-law might also have children. However, they were more likely to move area than our eldest son. So it was sensible to think of HaNiv where the older son and daughter-in-law, Menachem and Kate, were living. Now, HaNiv, where we live, and we're actually in the same mode as they are, just 6 blocks away from them, HaNiv is almost unique. It's on the western edge of Jerusalem, bordered by the Jerusalem forest. It is quite accessible by bus, cab, and even by walking to the center of the city. Nevertheless, it is different to much of the city in quite a few ways. First of all, the whole area is Orthodox. But that doesn't make it monochrome. There are Ashkenazim and Sephardim, Teimanim, and people who hail from almost all countries, Western countries and Eastern countries. There are, even among Ashkenazim, there are what we call Hasidim, and what we call Jews of Lithuanian background. And even, I know with this among Sephardim, there are Jews who came from North Africa. There is one gentleman I know whose parent, he was born in Jerusalem, but his parents came from Afghanistan. And obviously all around the Middle East. Even what we'll call in religious politics, there is quite a variety. There are religious Zionists, there are non-Zionists, there are even a few anti-Zionists, although they don't cause too much trouble to us. One other interesting thing about the area being almost virtually totally Orthodox is that when it comes to Shabbat, adults and children walk in the road. Now, when we first saw this, I really got worried. I said to Judy, you know, the children are walking in the road, it's dangerous. So she said, but it's Shabbos. There are no cars. I said, yes, but there are emergency cars. You know, we were once standing one Friday evening, we had visited people and we were on our way back and 3 cars passed by and they were all emergency cars. So she said, yes, but the emergency cars know there may be children on the road and therefore they drive carefully. So I've got to tell you about the lockdown. Just as your lives have changed during the lockdown, so has ours. We've increased reliance on home deliveries. And sometimes the children and grandchildren will get things for us. The grandchildren can pop round any time. Although over the past year, because we've been quite strict, we haven't let them into the house, into the flat. So what happens is they stand outside the door, ring the bell. We check that it's them and we bring chocolate and water to the door and we move back while they accept it. And now before the pandemic, so up till just a year ago, we would be eating with them quite regularly and they would be eating with us some of the time. This last year, that has not been the case. In fact, when it came to Seder, for the first time in our lives, it was just the 2 of us. Judy recited Manishtana for the first time in, well, actually she's only 21. I can't tell you it was the first time in over 50 years. But she recited Manishtana and she did very well when you consider the gap of time since she did it. Well, one actually thing that was really wonderful about Seder night was that there was an arrangement throughout the country that at a certain time, I think it was 8 o'clock in the evening, at a certain time, all children would go out on balconies and sing Manishtana. And everybody could go out on balconies and hear them. So I did, and it was very nice. I mean, the problem, of course, is that when you've got children from different roads and so on different balconies singing, you might get a cacophony, but nevertheless, the idea was wonderful. So as I just said, when it came to Seder night, it was just the 2 of us by ourselves. Now, as we and they have not been eating together, and also as our daughters-in-law lives have become much more hectic because of all the disruption from school. What has generally happened is that on Tuesday or Wednesday, Judy will speak to both daughters-in-law, check what they require for what they would like her to make for Shabbos, and she makes it. And either one of them either they themselves will come for it, or Judy will put it in bags, and I will take it to where it's our older son. I will take it to their block, and then one of the grandchildren comes down and meets me in the street outside the block, and I put down the bags and stand back, and then they take it. The children have had, in a sense, quite an exciting life. And this is because most of them have been in bidud at some stage. Now, bidud is a Hebrew word that basically means seclusion. So if you have been with somebody who's got the virus, once you're told about it, you have to go into bidud. You might be perfectly okay, but you go into seclusion for about, I think it's approximately 12 days. So most of the grandchildren who live near here have been in bidud at some stage. None of them, as far as we know, have had the virus, but they've been in school with friends who have, and therefore every now and again they go into bidud, and some handle it better than others. Some very much enjoy their own company. Some really thrive on company and find it far more difficult. Now, just this morning at 8:20 a.m., there was a ring of the bell. It was our almost 7-year-old granddaughter with some drawings that she had made just for us. One particular memorable event was about 1.25 years ago, on a Friday evening when we had a few new friends at our Shabbat table. There was a knock on the door. Our eldest grandson, age 14, and our youngest granddaughter, not yet 2, were at the door. What had happened was, after their Friday evening meal had finished, our oldest grandson, in order to give his parents a bit of an opportunity to clear the table, etc., took his younger sister out for a walk. As they passed our block of flats, and at that stage, her speech, she didn't say all that many words, she indicated that she wanted to go and see Bubba and Saba. And so they came up, knocked at the door, and our guests were as delighted as we were by the surprise that this almost 2-year-old young lady was walking in with her oldest brother. Now, that's the older family. Now to come to the second family. Our middle son, Avram David, and his wife, Nechami, had triplets almost 4 years ago, 2 girls and 1 boy. One advantage of triplets is that our daughter-in-law never needs to ask them what is happening in kindergarten. She just listens to them speaking to each other, and that tells her everything that's happening. One day, one of the triplets announced that Corona had finished. "How do you know?" said their mother. "You told us that Bubba and Saba will only come to our house again when Corona finishes. They were here yesterday." "They were here," said our daughter-in-law. "Yes," said the grandchild, "but they stayed in the computer." In other words, we had Zoomed in or Skyped in or whatever it was, and the triplets, then just about 3, assumed that we were actually there in their home. And they just couldn't understand why we didn't leave the computer. And therefore, Corona had gone. The triplets were joined by a baby brother last year on Seder night. In fact, this was the Seder we were looking forward to, because the triplets were supposed to do Manishtana for the first time. And at the end, of course, because of Corona, they weren't with us, but also because of their mother going into hospital, Erev Pesach. Neither she nor our son heard their very first Manishtana. It was their wonderful neighbors who looked after them for the Seder night who actually heard them. In any case, so as I said, the triplets were joined by a baby brother. Early on, one of the triplets, well, they were sitting on the floor and playing and chatting, and one of them piped up with, "I don't like baby." The second one said, "I love baby." And the third one said, "Sometimes I love baby and sometimes I don't." Now, a few months later, they are unanimous. They all love baby. However, we have yet to hold him. We see him on screen, and he has been brought to outside our apartment. But as yet, we haven't gone close. So how do we spend our time in lockdown? Well, if it had been about 100 years ago, we would have been tearing our hair out. But as it's now, we zoom into shiorim, to talks. I even joined one in Bushy for a few minutes this morning just to make sure that the link worked. There is a person in this apartment who joins exercise classes on Zoom and does Israeli dancing on Zoom. But I want you to know that person is not me. For the first 2 years, now I'm coming to politics. For the first 2 years we were here, we were not called upon to vote even once. But in the 2.5 years since, we have, or after a few weeks' time, we will have voted 6 times. In late 2018, there were the municipal elections. And there was therefore, the municipal elections means there's an election for the council where you vote for the parties. It's not like in Britain where you vote for the individual. You vote for a party list. And there's also a vote for the mayor. In fact, it's quite possible that the mayor can be the head of the party that doesn't even get seats, and that's what's actually happened on this occasion. So there was the election for the council and for the Jerusalem mayor, and then because none of the candidates for mayor got the requisite percentage, there was a runoff 2 weeks later. And then shortly afterwards came the first of what were then 3 national elections in 1 year. And of course, the 4th is going to be next month. Now, the first 3 national elections were during the year of mourning for my mother. Now, I knew exactly which 3 Israeli parties my mother approved of. So I actually felt that she was deciding that there would be 3 elections in order that I was able to vote for every party she was in agreement with. My difficulty, of course, is what to do for the 4th. So I could, of course, vote for a party that she wasn't in agreement with. There is a possibility that I might vote for a party that I previously voted for. But even if I do, since political parties here tend to split a little and merge a little, even if I vote for a party that I previously voted for, it will still be slightly different from any vote I have made before. Now, the subject of demonstrations, how we experience them. As our area is quite placid, we haven't experienced any local demonstrations. However, we have been held up by demonstrations in town. And most upsetting was one when Judy and I were on a bus. One evening, we were going from the time we had not yet moved into our apartment, and we were going from one son and daughter-in-law to the other son and daughter-in-law where we were going to sleep that night. And the bus driver is only supposed to stop at recognized bus stops. He's not supposed to stop between bus stops, even if he's held up by a traffic light. There have been one of the ultra-Orthodox demonstrations, and we were at a traffic light, and there were young men, probably teenagers, wanting to get on the bus. And he, of course, did not open the bus because he wasn't supposed to. What happened was they pushed the door, which under their combined pressure gave way. And one of them squirted the driver with some strong substance that actually reduced him to lying on the pavement outside. And every one of us leaving the bus because the smell was so strong. My wonderful wife wanted to stay to see if she could be of assistance. I, however, pointed out that within less than a minute, ambulances and police had arrived. And as we were not first aid nor police, the most helpful thing we could do was to walk on to the next bus stop and wait for the next bus, while the police deal with the riffraff and the ambulance deals with the driver. We were actually concerned what had happened to the driver, and we followed the news very much for the next 2 days and didn't hear anything. And that gave us the hope that he had recovered fully. Now, the demonstrators we have suffered from have been always from the anti-Zionist section of the Haredi. But we have friends who live in the center of town whose lives have been disrupted by the left-wing demonstrators outside the Prime Minister's home. So, in other words, life in Jerusalem can always be disrupted by demonstrators. Now, it's different in Bushi because remember, although there's always demonstrations in the center of London, they're not going to disrupt life as far out as Bushi. That only within, let's say, a mile or two of where they are. I titled this talk, Reborn in Israel, Life After Retirement. And what's also happened is, as I may have mentioned before, although I'm English born, and my mother was English born, in fact, we even had I even had a great-great-grandmother who lived the last few years of her life in London. Nevertheless, on my father's side, we have been in Israel since either around 1809 or at the latest the 1820s. It's the earliest possibilities that our ancestors who came in 1809, but even if they didn't, they were certainly in Israel and in Jerusalem by the 1820s. And this means that within my family, there are now at least 10 generations of people who have lived in Jerusalem. And the wider family is actually very large, and I actually don't connect to most of them because the numbers are, I must have a few hundred second cousins. However, the first cousins, my brother and I have 14 first cousins, all of whom live in Israel. In fact, only one of them ever lived outside Israel, and even she returned here some years ago. So on the occasions I visited Israel, I would rarely go to see my cousins. What I would do is I would go to see my uncles. And if any of their children were around, I would see them too. But since making Aliyah, we have been to various weddings and bar mitzvahs, both in my family and in Judith's family. And therefore, I have seen most of my first cousins far more regularly than I used to. There is, however, a problem with my first cousins. You see, of the 16 grandchildren that my paternal grandparents had, only 4 of us are boys. And as most of my family are Haredi, this means when it comes to a simcha, whether it's a bar mitzvah or wedding, the men are in one room and the ladies are in another. So what is happening is that Judy sits next to intelligent people, my first cousins. I sit next to their husbands, who are very nice people, and I enjoy speaking with them, but they didn't know my grandparents, whereas the ladies who Judy sits next to did know my grandparents. I do feel a little bit deprived, and when we get back home, I do say to Judy, well, can you tell me, was my cousin so-and-so there? Was my cousin so-and-so there? And how is my cousin? And she'll tell me how they all are. In fact, I found out that one of them wasn't well, only because Judy found out. Because bar mitzvahs and chasanas and weddings are segregated, this means that what I usually do is that I go to the mechitza, because behind the mechitza there will be the mother of either the bride or groom, who will be a first cousin of mine, and there will also be, in some cases, my aunt, who will be the grandmother. I call her my aunt. She's actually the widow of my youngest uncle. And so I will go to the edge of the mechitza, and they will come there, and I will wish them mazel tov. There was one occasion actually when I got further into the ladies, and what actually happened was this. I did have another aunt, a widow of another uncle, who died actually just a year ago, and she had had a leg amputated some years ago, and so she couldn't really get around much. What happened was, it was the wedding of one of her grandchildren, and I had the triplets were a few months old, and their parents had come to the wedding with the triplets, all in one pram. The pram actually came from Manchester. It was Lionel Finkelstein's oldest son's father-in-law was actually the designer of the pram. And with this pram, I went up to the mechitza, and my aunt who's still living, came to the edge of the mechitza and looked at the babies. She then came a few minutes later. She came to the mechitza and beckoned me. I came over. She said, "Your Aunt Golda is upset because you haven't shown her the triplets." So, since Auntie Golda couldn't get up, I walked into the ladies section with the triplets. I was the only man in the ladies section that evening. Now, in the last year, of course, I haven't been to that many simchas because of the pandemic. In fact, I think we've only had one cousin's child getting married in the last year, probably for that reason. Although we actually have seen some weddings by Zoom, but that was not in the family. That was well, those of you who remember the Seymours, Gerald Seymour, who's the son of the late Annette and Jeffrey Seymour, Gerald married off a son to a young lady from Hendon, whose mother teaches in the school where Judy used to teach. So we zoomed into that wedding, and in fact we saw Nikki marry Lige, who are cousins of the Seymours. They were at the wedding. In fact, I sent a text to Nikki. I said at 6:23 p.m. you were not wearing your mask, and I said, Big Brother is watching you, and he texted me back, but I am now, and I went on Zoom, and he was. Back to my family wedding. So as I said, in the last year, I haven't been to any family wedding. The year before, because it was the year that we were in mourning, that my brother and I were in mourning for our mother, I didn't go to the dinners. What I did do was I went right at the start. I went at the actual time arranged. Now, what happens in Haredi weddings, it happens in San Batil just as much as in Israel, is that a time is given for the start of the wedding. So let's say the time is given as 5:30. Everybody knows that the chuppah will not be till 7:30. And so people turn up an hour or two later than the time that the chuppah is advertised for. What I did during the year for my mother was that I got there at the beginning time. The reason was, my only purpose in going was to be at the chuppah, which had no problems for me because chuppahs in my immediate family, in my family of cousins, will not have music. The music will only start after the chuppah is finished. So I could be there even though I was in mourning. And so I went right at the beginning because that meant that I could wish Mazel Tov to my cousins and also to my aunt, who was in some of these situations a grandmother. And then I was at the chuppah, and the moment the chuppah finished, I left. On one or two occasions, as I got to the bus stop, Judy got off the bus because she didn't come for the chuppah. She was coming for the meal and for the dancing. And this, of course, is another thing, another difference between a Haredi wedding and the weddings that you're used to. The weddings that you're used to, you go and you're there for most of it. And if you've got 2 or 3 invitations, you only go to one. Here it's very different. Because there's so many large families, many people are getting invitations for, let's say, every other week. And they're not going to spend a night every other week at a simcha. So what quite often happens is, even if they happen to be the uncle and the aunt of the bride or groom, they might be only going in for half an hour. And then they leave and go home or to another simcha. So a simcha is very different here in the sense to the way we were used to in Bushi. I did mention earlier that I do go to shiorim, and in the last year, of course, those shiorim have been on Zoom. There is somebody who I knew many years ago who I learn with usually most afternoons. And some of you will know the name, and I tell it to you. His name is Bernard Chaitowitz. Now, you'll remember Rabbi Chaitowitz, who was a rabbi of Stanmore before Rabbi Jeffrey Cohen. And when he retired, he moved to Israel. And the reason why he and his wife, both of whom unfortunately passed away now, moved to Israel was because both their son and daughter were living in Israel. So Bernard Chaitowitz, who I knew years ago in London, we are of similar age. I say we're of similar age. He's turned 70 this week. I will turn 70 in 5 months' time. And we have established what we call a chavruta. We learn together most afternoons. I should mention the family we've left behind in Britain. So in Britain, we have our younger son, Ben Dov, who spoke to some of you on Zoom a couple of weeks ago. In fact, it was the night we had our second vaccination, and he spoke to about climate change. And we have, of course, our daughter Bracha, who's been in Ravenswood for the last approximately 30 years. And that's actually been quite a difficulty for us, because our intention when we made Aliyah was that we would be back approximately 4 times a year. At least one of us would be back, and in order that we would be able to visit Bracha quite regularly. What of course has happened is within the last year is that we have not been able to. The last time I visited Bracha was just under a year ago. Of course, Ben Dov is in Hendon and he's able to see her, but even he, because of the pandemic, has not really been able to. He has seen her on Zoom. In fact, Judy has also phoned and sung to her over the phone. But this is, in actual fact, we are very grateful to Ravenswood. They have been so strict during this pandemic. And yes, they have suffered, but the amount of suffering they have had has been much less than is the case in most care homes. And this is because they have been really very thorough in the way they have dealt with things during this terrible year. I have my brother in London. Judy has one sister in London. She has one sister in Israel, one sister in London, and her brother in Manchester. Although interesting enough, we have in Israel seen some of our brothers' children and grandchildren more often than we did when we were in Bushi, simply because a few of his children do live here. Although unfortunately during this last year, like most people, we haven't been able to see them. I think there was one couple we have seen during the pandemic. With the others, it's more a case of phone contacts. As some of you are Freemasons, just will conclude about Freemasonry here. Freemasonry here is very different to Britain. First, for a start, for certain reasons, the Grand Lodge of Israel connects to the Grand Lodge of Scotland. So this is a more, so therefore there will be rituals which will go with the Scottish rite rather than the English traditions. Also, whereas in England, I was in Craft and Chapter, in Israel, I've joined Craft. I've joined a lodge that is called Holy City Lodge, which was actually, I think it was actually started by British servicemen during the Mandate period, or possibly before. I need to check that out. But I can't join Chapter at the moment because in Israel, chapter is connected to mark. So I have to become a mark mason before I can join chapter. So there are differences. However, in the last year, I haven't been to Masonic meetings except on Zoom. So life has changed in that. Now, my guess is that there may be a few minutes for me to answer questions if you have any.
Rabbi Salasnik, that's been a lovely walkthrough of your brief life in Israel over the last 4.5 years. It sounds like, sort of as far as lockdown is concerned, it's very similar to how we're living in this country. It's a year since most of us have hugged our children and grandchildren, and Seder nights were the same as they were for you, with most of us on our own, not the normal family get-together. But I can see that mishpuchology is still part of your life. You mentioned Lionel Finkelstein's relatives, Pram, and many other relationships there. Clearly your memory is as good as it ever was in terms of recall. But it's lovely to see you. And as you said right at the beginning, probably the first time I've ever seen you without a tie. I have seen photographs of people taken when they visited you in Israel, sitting out in the sunshine, still with a tie on. So I'm delighted to see you looking relaxed and well. Right, now, chance for other people, and I'm sure there's plenty of people watching today who would like to ask you questions. So if you would like to indicate by electronically putting up your hand or just waving at us, we will try and get to you.
If nobody does, then you talk about the accident. I thought you should.
I can't see you all, so you might... Ronnie, did you want to ask? Unmute yourself.
Yes, Rabbi. I presume your fluency in Ivrit is as if as fluent as in English. Is that the case? And do you manage with both equally well?
Not really. I'll tell you why. Although in vocabulary, my Ivrit isn't bad, nevertheless, there's the what we call the wider fluency of a language. So in other words, I can make myself understood, but in terms of the actual fluency of the language, that is different. But it's more than that. Somebody once explained that one of the difficulties with what's called Haredi society here is because there are actually two languages. Now, that may sound surprising because after all, Israelis speak Ivrit. But it's two types of Ivrit. There's just as if you speak with, let's say you speak with a teenager, they will use words that you might not know, or they'll use words that you know in one context that they mean in another. For example, a few years ago, it used to be people, if people liked something, they say it's wicked. And of course, wicked for us meant something very different. And the same is happening here, because you have a sort of, we'll call it like a television culture. So Haredim who don't have television don't know that culture. So if you put, let's say, a Haredi teenager together with an average Israeli teenager, they'll be able to understand each other, but they will not necessarily always be speaking the same language. So there is the difficulty of what we'll call fluency, but there's also the difficulty that even the Ivrit that I will speak, they will use words that I might not understand in the context that they are using. I had an interesting experience on Friday, this last Friday night, which Judy told me I should tell you. But before I tell you, I just want you to know I am okay. Basically, on Friday night, as Shabbos was coming in, I slipped. I had had my shower. I came out and stupidly, I walked out without having dried my feet. And I slipped on the marble floor and hit my head on the wall. Judy said, I'm calling the chovesh. Chovesh is the basically first aid. I said, no, I'm perfectly okay. She said, blood is coming out of your head. You've got a gash. She called. This person came within a short while. I had not lost consciousness at any time. And he did check my reactions. He sat me down and said, I can tell you the good news and the bad news. Which one do you want first? I said, you may as well tell me the bad news first. He said, the bad news is you have to go to hospital. There's no choice. Even though it's Shabbos, you're going to hospital. The good news is that since you didn't lose consciousness, you're really okay. He called, and within a couple of minutes, 2 men entered. One was another first aid man, and the other one was an Arab. Because they have an arrangement that they, in other words, the first aid system in our area, in HaNiv, employ 2 Arabs over Shabbos. One is the secretary who deals with the phone calls, and the other is the driver. So they got me into the cab, they got me into the ambulance. Actually, I say got into the ambulance, I was able to walk. I just walked into the ambulance myself. And the one of the first aid Jews was with me, and the Arab was driving. And the Arab the Jew asked me for my that's my identity card, which I gave him. He gave it to the Arab. The Arab, while he was driving, spoke to the hospital, Sharia Tzedek Hospital, which is the nearest main hospital to us, and the hospital, and gave my identity number and names, and they were prepared for me when I arrived. What actually happened was they actually spelled my name wrongly. They missed out the nun, the equivalent of the N in my name. So it looked as if my name was Salasnik. In any case, I arrived. They gave me wonderful attention. It wasn't just a case of stapling my head. They gave me a CT scan, an ECG, a tetanus injection, checked my blood pressure, etc. I actually was in the hospital until just at 12:05, which is 10:05 for you. There were 2 interesting conversations I had. I'll tell you about the one with the Arab first. So one of the doctors were, just as the patients were Jews and Arabs, the doctors were Jews and Arabs, and so were the nurses. And there was one person who was also there who we got to speak, and I started speaking to him in Ivrit, and he said, my English is better. I said, where do you come from? He said, I'm an East Jerusalem Arab. I said, but how is your English is better? He said, well, I went to St. George's School in Jerusalem. Now, St. George's is a Church of England school. It's under the Anglican Diocese of Jerusalem. If you look it up on Wikipedia, they will tell you that they teach in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. But he told me that's not true. He said, I learnt in the St. George's, I became fluent in, obviously in Arabic, but also I'm pretty good on English. I do know Hebrew, but that's because I learnt it outside school. Now, I had an occasion, I'll come back to hospital soon. I had an occasion about a year ago where somebody who had to do some job for the Jerusalem municipality in our road asked me to read out something from his phone. So I read it out. And because he needed to know the next road he was going to. Apparently, he couldn't read Hebrew. He'd been given the instructions in Hebrew as to where he was going, but he could only read Arabic. The Jerusalem municipality is employing Arabs who cannot read Hebrew. They can speak it a bit, but they can't read it. Now, this might not be so surprising when you consider that most Jews go to schools where they learn Hebrew and English, but don't learn Arabic. So we actually have two cultures living very close to each other, interacting with each other, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, but most people not knowing the language or even the alphabet of the other. Back to hospital. So halfway through the evening, one of the nurses came to me to do a test, and she asked me my name. And I looked at her name, and I saw her surname was Vinograd. So I said to her, my name is Salasnik, but I'm also a Vinograd. So she said, I thought so, but I noticed that your name's been misspelled. I said, okay, which Vinograd are you? So she said, my father-in-law was so-and-so. Oh, in that case, your husband is my third cousin. But I didn't stop there. I said, your husband is also my third cousin once removed, because one of my grandmother's first cousins on one side married her aunt on the other side, and your husband is from that family, so we are doubly related. Okay. When she told me her husband's first name, I said, yeah, he's named after his uncle who was killed in the War of Independence. So she knew that I was alert. And this was very important because when I was discharged, she then said to me, how are you getting back? Now, I knew there was a choice. The choice was walking, which would be an hour's walk. Hoping there may be an ambulance going to my area, or getting a lift from an Arab cab driver and paying him after Shabbos. And I said to her, can I walk back? And she had seen my notes. She had seen I could walk. And she said, the weather conditions outside are okay. I think you can do it. So I left the hospital at 12:05. I actually did take a wrong direction for a few minutes. Then I knew exactly where I should be. And I got back into our apartment at 1:15 in the morning to see a young lady who was relieved because the last time she saw me a few hours before was when she had phoned was when she had called the first aid people. So she was really, I should mention, by the way, that because it was an Orthodox Jewish hospital, they gave me kiddush, hamotzi, and a meal. So I was really well treated.
Can I take the liberty of asking you a very short question, which you may choose to answer in one way or not at all? You mentioned, you spoke about voting. My general question is, would you be voting for a political party of any color or a religious party?
I haven't yet decided. I mean, at the moment I am between two options. What I will say is that in the previous three elections, I voted for both. I voted for a party that was not necessarily religious, and I voted for a party which was definitely religious, and I voted for one which is probably a mixture. So I mean, if you go back to the video that was done of my of the very nice leaving celebration which you all gave me in the Watford Coliseum, you may note that I said that it was my ambition to live long enough to vote for all the parties. And given the fact that these parties tend to both proliferate and change and go, and some of them go into, you know, some of them die, some of them are born, etc. It has been suggested that I might have to live to the age of 200 in order to fulfill the ambition of voting for every party.
It wouldn't be enough, Rabbi, the way Israel voting goes.
Well, it depends. If we keep on having 2 elections a year, we might do it.
Rabbi, I can't see any more questions, but I would like to ask you one.
Oh yeah, Henry's got a question.
Oh, go on then. Go on, Henry.
Unmute yourself.
You're on mute, Henry.
Unmute.
Unmute yourself. Okay,
Well,
go on, Henry.
Around you, Rabbi, in HaNiv, there must be many, many shul. Which ones don't you go to?
In the first 6 months we were here, I found that I've been to 23. Now, I need to give definition of that. 23 might include, for example, one of those 23 was an apartment where there was a gentleman who couldn't get out of his apartment, and therefore they had a few Shabbos services in his apartment for his benefit. So, but of those 23, I've only now probably added 1 or 2 more in the 4 years since then. So the ones I go, there are probably a half a dozen that I have gone to far more than the others. I mean, it's a little bit different at the moment because what's happening presently because of the pandemic is that in our own building, in the downstairs lobby, there is all Shabbos services. There's also in the building next to Menachem, there is a large garden, and in fact, our second grandson, Hudi, his bar mitzvah was because of the pandemic, was actually outside on the garden. Fortunately, it was August and the weather was warm. And there was an area where Judy and Kate could actually go to. In fact, I actually put up the mechitza myself for her just before Shabbos. So I have been to davening there as well. There's also, just before Rosh Hashanah, across the road from us, they put up, I call it the chuppahs, basically a series of canopies where people held their Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services. And following that, they decided to continue. So most weekdays, Mincha and Ma'ariv, I go there. Although if the weather is fine, I actually don't go under the canopy. I actually stand on the other side of the road, so that I'm further at a distance. There's a very kind man who, just before Ma'ariv, goes over to the canopies and takes a chair, and he puts the chair down so that when I arrive, because I'm white bearded, he thinks I'm older than I am. And when I arrive, I sit there. In fact, there are times I don't feel I need to sit. I sit there because this very kind man has got me a chair. But before the pandemic started, so the shuls I went to most were there is the Boston Hasidic shul, where, I mean, it's called Boston because the gentleman who was called the Boston Rebbe founded it. And that shul is the building next door us. And it also has lots of davening. So in other words, you have davening from around 5:30 in the morning for the first chapters, and the last chapters can be 8:39. And they also have several mincha times, several mile times. So in other words, it's the most convenient. Nearby is an Ashkenazi shul, which I sometimes go to. There is also a Sephardi shul in the road below us, and there's the National Religious Shul. So those are the four shuls I would go to more often. And there's also a minyan in Menachem's building, which until the pandemic, I was actually going to most Shabbos mornings. So those are the five that I would normally be going to. And the others, I just go to if I'm in that area.
Okay, did I see the Hammermans? Yes.
Yeah.
Go on
Hi.
then.
Hi, it's Rita Hammerman speaking here. Lovely seeing you. You look very well, and I can see you very, very happy. One question I would like to ask you, I mean, it's not something, you know, unusual, but are you being used now to the way of life that Israeli are? Obviously, they're all different to us. They've got more of a temperament and so on, the time I've been there. Did you get used to their way of life, and has it been easy?
Well, in one sense, yes. In another sense, no. You never get used to people not queuing. In other words, there's a certain culture we've grown up with that it's the culture of queuing, and when you're in the culture of not queuing, it takes a long time to get used to it. But I'll tell you an interesting experience I had. It has a sadness to it as well. Early on, I went to a bar mitzvah. The mitzvah boy was the son of one of my cousins, and I knew that my cousin's husband had two English brothers-in-law. One came from Hendon, and the other one, who I'd never met before, came from Sunderland. So I spoke with the one from Hendon, and then I said, there's somebody here from Sunderland. He said, yes, I'll introduce you to him. So I meet this person who left Sunderland he left Sunderland around 1970. And we spoke and so on, and he said to me, so how have you found it? At that stage, I'd only been in Israel six months. I said, well, let me put it this way. I was expecting certain things to be strange, like putting on tefillin on the day that in England is Simchas Torah, or saying the prayer for rain a couple of months earlier in Israel than one does in England, and those various other things. I said, but because I was ready for it, I didn't find it strange. So what I do find strange is Sunday morning, because I get up on Sunday morning and it feels very strange being the same day as Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. And he replied to me, I have now been in Israel almost 50 years, and I have not yet got used to Sunday morning. In other words, there are certain things that are so much ingrained in one's childhood that one cannot get used to it. Now, when I said there's a sad part of this story, this particular gentleman who came from Sunderland, he died a few months ago. He was one of the corona victims. There it is. Was there anything else?
No, okay, Rabbi.
Yeah.
We are really grateful for your time. It's been lovely seeing you, looking well, Canadian horror, as they say. Please give our warmest regards to Judy.
She's on Zoom herself.
Is she? I hadn't seen her. Judy, lovely to see you. Keep well yourself and well. I just want to refer back to one of your early comments you made about pressing the ability for rabbis to press the silent button. I think that sounds a wonderful idea, and I'm sure many of your rabbinic colleagues would love the idea during services to be able to press a button and the congregation go quiet. But I think we'll have to work on that, whether it's possible or not. So thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Keep well, keep safe, and enjoy the sunshine.
Thank you very much.
And I hope we see you again in the future at one of our stage meetings.
Okay.
Rabbi, it's Daphne here. I just personally want to say thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us today. It's been very enlightening, and I reiterate all the things that Stuart said. We hope that you stay well and safe, and best regards to Judy too. So please take care, and thank you very, very much.
Pleasure.
If any of you want to just stay on and chat to each other, feel free as always.
Rabbi, it was good to see Ben Dov the other week, to hear him, even with his ponytail that he offered to skirt.
You see, the difference is that Ben Dov doesn't have a hairdresser. I have one. Judy, about 2 months into the pandemic, I said to Judy, look, I'm not sure what to do. I've got 3 choices. Choice 1 is I shave everything off and let it grow again. Choice 2 is I go to the barber. And choice 3 is you cut my hair. Judy has now been cutting my hair every 2 months.
Do you give her a tip at the end?
I can see that Jack and Maureen are having their tea already, so I think, you know, maybe it's time for some of us to. Nice cake, was it, Jack?
No, Israeli date, actually.
Okay.
Rabbi Salasnik, Pamela from Israel, your cousin, just joined. Hi, I joined the lovely Zoom session this afternoon, and it was great to hear from you. And had a lot of very similar comments living here that you have mentioned.
You heard this from Stella or from Sheila?
I actually heard it from Maitland and Carol.
Ah, okay. Okay, now the reason I ask is because this Ronnie, who's been speaking, is an old friend of Sheila, who we know as Sheila Liebach, but is her married to Simons. Okay. And they told Sheila, and Sheila told 1 or 2 others in the family.
So it's lovely hearing you. We wish you keep well.
Thanks.
Thank God we've got our vaccines and we can keep going a bit here. Okay.
We're trying to catch up with you from the UK. Nice.
Hello, Rabbi. Cyril here.
Okay.
Hi.
Now, just to explain who Pamela is, who just spoke. So many of you know Stella and Lawrence Bentley.
Yes.
Yeah. And some of you know Maitland and Carol Rose.
Yeah.
So they have another brother and another sister. Pamela is their sister who used to live in Reading and now lives in Netanya.
Oh. Can I just say, this is Sheila Simons, and I'd like to say hello to all of the family that are on there. And it was very interesting to see you and to hear you.
I can see, Rabbi, we're not going to let you go that easily. So we want to get our money's worth, obviously.
Yes. Hello, Rabbi.
Hello.
Could you answer a question? Do you drive in Israel?
Judy does. Judy does. She hasn't gone that she's only driven within Jerusalem. I by choice have not. And the reason is because I'm so used to driving on one side of the road that I'm worried about that. And the truth is, but the bus service, although I haven't been on a bus for almost a year, but the bus service here is very good. So therefore I think that the bus is good.
Buses twice, yes. Yes.
That the bus is very good, and there are occasions when we use cabs as well.
Hello, Rabbi. It's Marion Offenbach here. It's lovely
Hello.
to see you. And your story about going to the hospital on Shabbat reminds me of when Judy and I think it was Menachem, when she cut her leg in shul. Do you remember? A lot of years ago. And we may have been surprised seeing she and Menachem going up in a cab on Shabbos because she had to go to the hospital.
And what actually happened was Judy was brought back by ambulance, and Menachem walked back.
Oh.
And it wasn't Watford; it was Mount Vernon, because we were told that Mount Vernon that she would get seen quicker in Mount Vernon than she would than she would be seen in Watford. So Menachem had an even longer walk back.
Some walk, that is. Okay, we're going to let Rabbi go now. Okay.
Thank you so much. And keep well.
Keep well.
Keep cheerio. Keep well. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, yeah. Bye-bye. Yeah.
The snow has stopped, would you believe?
And the sun is out.
Haven't quite got here, but maybe it is.
Very nice afternoon, very enjoyable.
Thank you.
Good.
It was
I
fantastic.
will keep well, keep safe. I forgot to mention
Thank
what we've
you.
got next week, didn't I? For those of you who are still on, what am I looking at next week? The rise and fall of the Bournemouth Jewish hotels with Jeffrey Feld. That's something to look forward to. So see you all next week, or see some of you on Thursday for current affairs.
Thursday, yeah.
Take well, keep well, take care.
Be well. Bye.
Bye.
No, I'm going to phone. You're going to make me a cup of tea.